Good evening. Let me start with a fact that should make you uncomfortable. Alliances do not collapse with explosions. They fracture when rules are violated quietly and ignored long enough. Today, Canada expelled a sitting United States ambassador. Not recalled, not rotated, not quietly reassigned. Expelled. That word is not diplomatic theater. It is institutional language. And institutions only use it when something fundamental has already failed. Most people will hear this and think of politics. They will think of personalities, statements, retaliation. That is a mistake. This was not about a moment. It was about a pattern. A pattern where the boundaries that protect sovereignty were tested, stretched, and treated as flexible until Canada decided that silence was more dangerous than confrontation. If you want to understand how power actually breaks systems, not loudly, but structurally, stay with me, because once a sovereign line is enforced, it does not reset quietly. It redraws the map of what is possible. Bridge to part 2. To see why this decision carried such weight, we need to be precise about what ambassadors are supposed to represent and what they are never allowed to become. To understand why this moment matters, we have to strip away the drama and return to first principles. Ambassadors are not free actors. They are not commentators. They are not political enforcers. They exist inside one of the most rigidly defined roles in international life precisely because history taught us what happens when that line blurs. Diplomacy is designed to lower temperature, not raise it. To transmit messages, not to apply pressure. To represent a state, not to reshape the internal politics of the host country. When an ambassador begins to act as an influencer inside domestic affairs, the problem is no longer diplomatic style, it becomes institutional legitimacy. The host nation is forced into a choice it never wants to face: accept interference and appear diminished, or respond and absorb the consequences. Canada's decision tells us that this threshold had already been crossed more than once. Quiet warnings failed. Informal channels were exhausted. What remained was not misunderstanding, but precedent. And precedent is dangerous because it outlives administrations. To see why governments treat this boundary so seriously, we need to look at where these rules came from and what happens when history shows they are ignored. To understand why this boundary exists at all, we have to step back from the present and look at the logic that built the diplomatic system in the first place. Modern diplomacy was not designed out of idealism. It was designed out of failure. Centuries of conflict taught states that when representatives became instruments of pressure rather than channels of communication, escalation became almost automatic. Wars did not begin with armies. They began with envoys who pushed too far, spoke too loudly, or acted as if access meant authority. That is why diplomatic roles were narrowed, codified, and constrained. Immunity was paired with restraint. Access was balanced with limits. The system was built on a simple trade. Representatives are protected, but only as long as they respect the sovereignty of the host state. This was never about courtesy. It was about stability. When those limits are ignored, history shows a predictable cycle. First comes tolerance, then normalization, then erosion. And finally, rupture, when a government decides the cost of inaction has become higher than the cost of response. Canada's move fits squarely into that historical pattern. Not as an outlier, but as a textbook correction. And like most corrections in complex systems, it did not arrive gently. It arrived at the moment pressure finally turned into crisis. The first real crisis point did not announce itself with a press conference. It surfaced in silence. At some point, Canadian officials stopped asking whether the situation could be managed and started asking whether allowing it to continue would permanently weaken their authority. That is the moment every system fears, because it means the problem is no longer tactical. It has become existential. This was not a flare-up. It was an accumulation. Each warning that went unheeded narrowed the space for retreat. Each boundary tested without consequence taught the wrong lesson. And eventually, restraint stopped looking like diplomacy and started looking like acquiescence. That is when Canada acted. Expelling an ambassador is not escalation by accident. It is escalation by design. It is a signal written not for headlines, but but for institutions, domestic courts, allied governments, future negotiators, stating that the rules still apply, even when enforcement is costly. If you are trying to understand power, this is a critical point. Systems do not fail when they are challenged. They fail when challenges go unanswered. If this analysis is helping you see how these moments actually unfold, stay with me. Because what comes next is not about the decision itself, but the machinery underneath it. To grasp why this response was unavoidable, we need to examine the hidden mechanism that governs how influence is exercised and miscalculated between unequal partners. Beneath every diplomatic crisis like this, there is a mechanism that rarely gets named, but always does the damage. It is the assumption that proximity equals permission. In unequal relationships, power often becomes informal before it becomes abusive. Access turns into expectation. Influence turns into habit. And eventually, pressure is applied not because it was authorized, but because it was never punished before. That is how boundaries erode without anyone announcing that they have crossed them. For years, the United States has operated inside a system where its closest partners are also its most integrated ones. Trade, security, intelligence, and regulatory systems overlap so deeply that friction feels costly for everyone involved. That depth can encourage a dangerous miscalculation, the belief that resistance will always be delayed for the sake of stability. Canada's response exposes the flaw in that logic. Interdependence does not erase sovereignty. It only disguises the moment when it is being tested. And when influence begins to resemble control, the system corrects itself often abruptly. This is not about hostility. It is about calibration. Influence that is not restrained by consent eventually provokes enforcement. That is the mechanism Washington appears to have underestimated. And once that miscalculation is made, the correction rarely stops at the diplomatic level. It moves quickly into pressure points that are far harder to contain. The second crisis point emerges when consequences stop being hypothetical and start moving through real systems. Diplomacy rarely breaks in isolation. Once trust fractures at the top, pressure travels downward into trade flows, regulatory cooperation, and the quiet agreements that keep complex economies functioning smoothly. What looked like a political dispute suddenly becomes a logistical one. This is where miscalculation becomes expensive. North American integration is not symbolic. It is mechanical. Supply chains cross borders multiple times before a product is finished. Energy markets rely on regulatory alignment, not just contracts. Transportation networks function on assumptions of continuity. When those assumptions are shaken, even briefly, friction multiplies. And friction has a way of revealing leverage. Neither side can escalate freely without hurting itself. That is what makes this phase so dangerous. Strength must be signaled without triggering damage that rebounds domestically. Resolve must be shown without collapsing cooperation that millions of people depend on. This is the moment where diplomacy either stabilizes or hardens. Because when systems tighten, the impact does not stay at the level of governments. It moves quickly into the lives of ordinary people. This is where the story reaches you. Because when diplomatic trust erodes, it does not remain an abstract dispute between capitals. It shows up quietly in the systems that shape daily life. Prices edge upward, contracts slow, investment hesitates. Jobs tied to cross-border certainty become fragile long before anyone uses the word crisis. If you work in manufacturing, your supply chain depends on predictability, not politics. If you work in energy, stability matters more than statements. If you depend on exports, timing is everything. And uncertainty is corrosive. What makes moments like this unsettling is that the costs are rarely announced. They accumulate. Small delays, cautious decisions, deferred expansions. For most people, the pressure feels indirect but persistent. You are not told why something changed. You are simply asked to absorb it. That is the hidden burden of diplomatic breakdown. It asks ordinary citizens to carry risks they did not choose, created by decisions far above them. If you want to understand why sovereignty is defended so fiercely, this is why. It is not abstract pride. It is about protecting the conditions that allow everyday life to function without disruption. If this perspective sharpens how you see power and consequence, stay with me. Because the impact of this decision does not stop at the border. It reverberates outward into the global system, watching closely. Beyond North America, this moment is being read less as a dispute and more as a signal. Allies pay closest attention when friction appears, where stability is assumed. Canada is widely viewed as a rule-bound, predictable partner, precisely the kind of country that absorbs pressure quietly rather than confronts it publicly. When a government with that reputation takes an action this severe, it forces other capitals to ask a simple question: what behavior triggered it? That question matters. Alliances function on expectations more than declarations. Governments watch how influence is exercised, how warnings are handled, and whether boundaries are respected in practice. This episode becomes data, not about rhetoric, but about reliability under strain. For many partners, the concern is not escalation, it is ambiguity. When diplomacy blurs into interference, cooperation begins to feel conditional. Exposure is reassessed, dependencies are quietly mapped. Alignment becomes more cautious. None of this happens in speeches. It happens in planning documents, procurement decisions, and long-term strategy reviews. That is how global systems adjust slowly, silently, and decisively. And once those adjustments begin, the future stops being a single path and splits into competing outcomes that depend entirely on what happens next. From here, the future does not move in one direction, it branches. The first path is stabilization. Washington recognizes that a boundary was tested and adjusts behavior accordingly. Not rhetorically, but operationally. Influence becomes disciplined again. Channels are repaired quietly. The relationship cools, then recalibrates. Trust does not fully return, but it becomes functional. This is the least visible outcome and the most constructive. The second path is managed tension. No escalation, but no real correction either. Statements soften, behavior changes only partially, and uncertainty lingers. Cooperation continues, but with friction built in. Allies hedge. Canada remains firm. Washington remains defensive, and the system operates below its potential. This is survivable, but costly over time. The third path is hardening. Signals are misread. Pride overrides adjustment. Pressure is met with counter-pressure. What began as a diplomatic correction becomes a template for confrontation. Trust erodes not just bilaterally, but across alliances. Once that happens, repair becomes generational, not tactical. History shows us something important here. Systems rarely collapse because of one bad decision. They collapse because early warnings are dismissed. And that brings us to the real meaning of this moment, what it reveals about power, restraint, and the future of diplomacy itself. So this moment is not really about one ambassador or even one decision. It is about how power is exercised when no one is watching, about whether diplomacy is treated as a strategic asset or as a disposable tool, and about what happens when boundaries are tested not by force, but by habit. Canada has already made its choice. It chose enforcement over convenience, precedent over silence, and in doing so, it reminded the system of something easy to forget. Sovereignty only exists if it is defended before it disappears. Now, the weight shifts to Washington because the world is not looking for outrage or retaliation. It is watching for restraint, for recalibration, for evidence that influence can still be exercised without erasing consent. What happens next will not be decided in a speech. It will be revealed in behavior quietly, consistently, and over time. Moments like this do not end alliances overnight, but they do change how they function. If you want to understand where diplomacy is heading in an era of pressure, bravado, and shrinking trust, this is the place to watch. And if this kind of analysis helps you see beneath the headlines, stay with me. There is more ahead, and it will matter even more than this.